If you've ever been through a divorce or been friends with someone who has and who hasn't fallen into one of those categories, you know that divorce can be messy. More times than not, in fact, I would say there's some uncomfortable moments because, after all, it is a breakup and there's sometimes a lot of assets and there are kids involved. So how do you go through a divorce as painlessly as you can? My next guest has some tips. Diana Isaac is a associate family lawyer at Shulman Law Firm. Good morning.
Thanks for having me.
So let me ask you, Diana, can a divorce be relatively drama-free?
It can. I mean, in my experience, I've seen it be more amicable in nature rather than quite contentious, yes.
Is there a common denominator? Does it come to a point where both sides have kind of looked at each other and said, we've fallen out of love? I mean, do they both have to be with the program for this to happen?
Yeah, for the most part, I find that when parties are less emotional and they're focused on the legal issues, or let's say they have been separated and they've said, you know what, I think our marriage has been over for a while.
Yeah.
I find in those cases, yes, the emotions are somewhat dissipated and they're focused on finality and moving forward.
So, I mean, the separation is a huge indication that it's the beginning of the end. So do you suggest that maybe before breaking the news to your spouse who may not feel the way you do, you say, let's begin with the separation and see how it goes?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have that discussion and say, I don't think this is working out. I think it's time to separate. And there are situations where people live under the same roof and they're still separated as well. So
we don't have stats. I mean, we know the stats on the number of divorces, although it's getting less and less every year in terms of divorce rate. I think it's went from 50 to 40 something, depending on when you start counting. They're saying those who married in the 1990s to 2000s are actually staying married longer, although it hasn't been in such a long time. I mean, there's stats can work any way you can. But do you find, are there any stats in terms of how separations actually lead to divorce as opposed to reconciliation?
In my experience, I've noticed that there are some parties that separate, and we, initiated the proceedings, and we start working on trying to get a resolution. And some of them actually, in the process, decide to reconcile. But in my experience at Shulman Law Firm, some of those people do end up coming back and say, we've tried, and it has not worked out.
So let's talk about the positive here. So if you've started the process, you've pretty well gone down the road of saying it's over. So what triggers the turnaround?
In terms of reconciliation?
Yeah.
Or?
Once the paperwork has started, how do you say, I think I've changed my mind?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, there's a plethora of reasons. Some people say, we want to make an extra effort for the sake of the children. Some people say, you know what, I've forgiven them for the infidelity. We're trying marital counseling, and so we're giving this another shot.
Okay. There's a number of questions here that I think I want to go through very quickly because they'll be very helpful to our audience who's considering or in the middle of it. Where do you start if you want a divorce?
I mean, I would recommend, not just as being a lawyer, I think you really need to retain a lawyer as soon as possible.
What about a mediator? Mediators seem to be more and more popular. Couldn't you start there?
Mediators, let's not forget that a mediator really is impartial, right? So it's a dispute resolution process. They're not going to have your best interests at mind. What they're doing is trying to facilitate a mutually satisfactory settlement. So it really is an extension of the parties' own negotiations. It's, of course, a private process, and this individual, which usually is a very senior family law lawyer as a mediator, will try to provide some recommendations to facilitate some resolution. But at the end of the day, as a client, you need to have your lawyer on board to say, you know what, this is a reasonable resolution and it is in your best interest. Do you let your spouse know before calling the lawyer? I get this question quite a bit, and I think really it depends on the circumstances. Sometimes clients say, if I have that initial conversation with my ex, I think that as a result of not being shocked about it, it opens the doors to a more amicable resolution. I think they say if you send a letter, they're going to think, you know what, this means battle, this means we're going to be arguing. So it's nice to give them a little bit of a heads up. It really does depend on the rapport between the parties. Yeah,
I mean, I have a friend of mine who left her husband, and she says that she negotiated the best divorce possible because she almost went to him him and said, hey, I've fallen out of love, blah, 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 and sort of talked him through it,
right.
versus, and they, to this day, they can still communicate, and they've moved on with their lives, versus those who kind of say, I'm out of here, I'm out the door, because they waited too long, because they got frustrated and angry. And so almost the sooner you have the conversation, the better it is, not only
right.
for the couple, but for you, right?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, at Shulman Law Firm, we understand this is a challenging time for clients. Sometimes people say, I was never expecting I was going to, get divorced. And this level of heightened emotions where people may feel confused or there's sadness or betrayal, it becomes very difficult to steer your case and get a resolution when you're emotionally charged. And this is one of the important things and why I emphasize it's important to have a lawyer, because you want someone to strategize on your behalf. You want someone to assess what's reasonable, creating a buffer between you and your ex. And of course, at the end of the day, everyone wants finality, right? And to protect their best interest.
Is there one exception to the rule here? Infidelity?
I mean, yes, I think that in situations where there is infidelity, there are a lot of emotions. Obviously, there's, sadness, betrayal, and sometimes confusion when they didn't even know about it. But I think at the end of the day, it's important for people to focus on the legal issues and moving forward, especially when you have children, right? Mm-hmm. And move forward and start a new chapter rather than remaining stuck with this, what's happened, because that can be very costly emotionally and financially.
Well, and if infidelity is the issue, if you've cheated on your spouse, chances are you've known for a long time that it isn't working out. So why would you possibly make your case worse for yourself? Shouldn't you address the issue earlier, as opposed to, it's seen often you're sabotaging your marriage, and this is going to be the catalyst that'll end it. But if you know early on and admit it to yourself and maybe your spouse, you can either A, make it easier, or B, save the marriage.
I think if you're more candid, even with things like prenuptial agreements and things like infidelity, I say, if you are candid to begin with, sometimes that does help. But, people have their reasons.
Mm-hmm. Prenup, are they more popular than ever?
Yes, we are noticing at Shulman Law Firm that they're getting more and more prevalent.
Huh. And even if they're not rich and with lots of properties, you're seeing prenups?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are various reasons why people want to enter into a marriage contract, which is what we call it in Canada. I've seen clients seek a marriage contract when they're on their second or third marriage, and they're looking to really maintain what financial security is left since the dissolution of their, let's say, previous relationship or marriage.
I was going to say, is it often the experience of the so-called starter marriage when you want to go in and arm yourself with the best possible, and also be honest with the person who's, probably experienced the same sort of thing, or just look in their circle of friends to say, hey, this is much better. Even though we want to be together forever, we also know that this will be there to make our lives easier should it not work out.
Right. I mean, interestingly, millennials are getting married later in life. So they're really coming into marriage with more assets, and they have a lot of income potential in terms of growth. Right. So they do want to protect that as well.
My guest is Diana Isaac. She is Associate Family Lawyer at Shulman Law Firm. A couple of questions I want to address in just a second. How do you speed up the divorce? How long is the average divorce? And what's the best way to save money when you want to, put this to bed? We'll get to that in just a moment. But first, at 10:15, let's go to the CJAD Traffic Center. Brought to you by Marche Epicure, your neighborhood grocery. Epicure.
800.
We're holding your hand through a divorce because it can get messy, it can get expensive, and it can take a long time. My guest is Diana Isaac. She's Associate Family Lawyer at Shulman Law Firm. Hey, Diana, is there an average time from beginning to end that we can kind of gauge as the average or the normal divorce?
I wish. I think I always explain to clients it really does depend on the parties. So the more acrimonious the matter, the longer the dispute. So, of course, when we're resolving the matter outside of court, it's a lot more expeditious as you can control the process. And when you're going through court proceedings, well, typically that's going to be more time-consuming because it depends on the court's availability. And there's a process in place, and there's certain steps you need to take.
I know friends who, it's rather amicable. It's not exactly, friendly, but they agree to disagree. Then they start with mediation. They get sort of the assets on paper, and then they proceed to a lawyer to do the legal aspect. Is that happening more and more?
Well, what we notice is that clients will come to us and will talk about the legal issues, what's in their best interest, and we may be able to resolve it amongst counsel. And when we've reached an impasse or we cannot seem to merge the gap on issues, that's when we contemplate getting a mediator in order to assist with resolving a particular issue or an issue.
Yeah. Okay, ways to speed up the divorce. Any tips?
Yes, I think for a happy divorce, you should try to remain child-focused when there's children involved.
Yeah.
I find that when focusing on their best interests rather than sometimes what you see is children are being used as a tool, that seems to drag out the issue more because it's a lot more acrimonious and there's a lot more emotions, of course. I also think being respectful to one another in this difficult time is important. An emotional divorce can be a very expensive divorce. There's a lot of inflammatory language which, you may find in court documents and text messages between the parties. And of course, I think that works in turn to perpetuate conflict, right?
I have a friend of mine who's been divorced now several years. There's a 9-year-old daughter involved, and it is ridiculous how many times she has to call her lawyer because of whatever, the dispute with the ex. Is there a way not to keep those charges mounting when you've walked away from a divorce and it wasn't a happy ending?
I think when you have child-related issues, considering a parenting coordinator is very good. Having very clear language in separation agreements or what we call a parenting agreement is important. The more you spell out, the more succinct you are, the less there is an option for interpretation, and parties know what their rights and obligations are.
Can you force your ex to sit with the mediator if they're absolutely not, short of, violating the agreement, but just in terms of being mean? Is there any way you can force them to a mediator to kind of solve and clear the air somewhat, or because I hear stories that it doesn't get better?
Well, yeah, the thing is with mediation, it's an entirely voluntary, non-binding process. So usually I would say that in situations where parties are not that far apart and they genuinely want to resolve the matter, then mediation makes sense. If you have someone that is not genuinely interested in resolving the matter and is being extremely difficult and unreasonable, mediation may not be the method of resolution.
If infidelity is involved and you get to the point of spousal support, would that possibly affect how much, will the judge take that into account because of the nature of the divorce being infidelity?
I get that question up. It's a frequent question, but unfortunately not. The blameworthy conduct, although I find morally this may be very difficult for a party to accept, but when it comes to spousal support, the entitlement factors that we consider are, the relief of financial hardship, sharing the economic burden of child support equitably, assisting a spouse to become economically self-sufficient. There isn't really anything that deals with someone cheating.
Okay, a couple of questions from our texters, our listeners this morning. Someone sold their business post-divorce. Does the sale have to be taken as income, therefore X gets more child support?
In terms of selling a business, there's the issue of property when you're married, and when we're dealing with the equalization of net family properties, in Ontario, we're dealing with more property division, but also when we're dealing with business, we do get a chartered or certified business valuator to assist with values, and that becomes
so important. In advance?
Yes.
Okay. Any way to pay child support, so make sure it goes to the children and not pay the mortgage of the ex-wife or husband?
Well, the child support guidelines are binding, and really the philosophy and objective of it is what is the cost of it in order to rear a child. So there isn't really a way of regulating this budget. It's contingent on one's income and who has the children for at least 40% of the time.
And as long as those requirements are being met, regardless of how the money's being spent, you don't have a case.
Yeah, it's very difficult to manage how those funds are being used.
Yeah. It's a sort of nitpicking, too, potentially, is it not? If there's no real case here of neglect, they're not getting clothes, they're not getting the foods they need, or we're not paying for your hockey. I mean, you got to sort of, you can't nickel and dime as long as the needs are being met.
Right, because this is about daily needs of the child. So to have a roof over their head, in order to have clothing and food and stuff like that, when we're talking about things like, rep hockey and soccer, these are considered extraordinary expenses, or what we call Section 7 expenses, and that's different and in addition to child support.
How do you get a divorce when you can't afford a lawyer? That's another texter.
Well, I think it depends on your income. I mean, there's also legal aid as an option. When you earn, and if you're eligible. I think that in order to be, let's say, cost effective when it comes to a divorce, you should try to be as organized as you can with financial disclosure. It's very important in order to settle a matter. I think also one's view to how to settle a matter is important. If you are apt to bringing family members and friends in a dispute, I think it really does compound issues. A lot of times as well.
Do they need to divide, or the question is, do I need to divide my pension when I get divorced?
If you are married, yes. That's a very common one.
Wow.
Where people are quite surprised.
Yeah, being the justification of that being still income.
The part of pension is considered an asset for the purposes of the what we call the technical term of equalization of net family property. So it goes as part of the assets and is divided.
All right, lots of information there. You're a wealth of information, Diana Isaac, associate family lawyer at Shulman Law Firm. It must be tough at some days, being involved in divorces every day.
You know what? This, for me, I always find it interesting. There's a lot of value. At Shulman Law Firm, we really do appreciate the difficulty people face in this challenging time. And I really enjoy helping people. I really like to see people moving on and starting a new chapter in their life. So for me, it's something that I've always been interested in. I find it fascinating. And I come from a large family of 6 sisters, so I deal with a lot of people.
We now know who you're pulling for, Diana. I'm kidding. Thanks for your time, Diana. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Coming up, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. It's a new book. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. Their assessments right after the news here at CJAD 800.
No radio at work? No problem. Grab the digital stream at CJAD.com. Tom.